Welcome to the University of Delaware Center for Disabilities Studies webinar on the state's absentee balloting system, the use of that system by people with disabilities, and related accessibility and security issues. I'm Victor Schaffner, and today's event is part of the Center's Lunchtime Learning Series events that we host throughout the year that examine policies and programs that support or otherwise significantly impact people with disabilities and their families. I'd like to introduce the members of today's panel. Anthony Albence is Delaware's Election Commissioner. Chris Ramos is the Delaware Department of Elections Director of Information Technology. Laura Waterland is the Delaware Disabilities Law Program Director, and Virginia Atkinson is the International Foundation for Electoral Systems Senior Global Advisor for Inclusion. Toward the latter portion of today's session, which should end near 1 o'clock, we will pose some of your questions to our panelists. You can send them during today's event to the chat room at the bottom of your screens. Zach Davis, also from the Center for Disability Studies, will assist me in fielding those questions. To start us off, Laura, could you please tell us the ways in which historically people with disabilities haven't had equal access when it comes to absentee balloting, why that's a significant hardship, and also what's inherently inaccessible about paper balloting?
Okay, I think first of all to remember some basic principles about voting access for people with disabilities. One is that people have the right to vote independently and privately. And then also that voters with disabilities should have equal access to other voters in terms of technology and ways of voting. Before the Help America Vote Act, after I think it was enacted in 2004, but there was really no federal statute other than ADA, that really addressed voting access. And the really important part of HAVA from our perspective was the requirement that each state provide at least one accessible voting system. Delaware was a little bit ahead of the curve with that at the time because the technology that they had in place actually had, the machines that they used had some fairly, at the time, advanced accessibility features. But we never really addressed the absentee voting system. And I think Anthony can talk more about how that has developed actually with the overseas voting program. So a big advancement was HAVA and the requirement that there be accessible voting systems in place. The disability vote is actually a pretty substantial vote. There were 14 million voters with disabilities who voted in 2016. Based on some numbers, roughly between 15 and 20% of Delaware's registered voters have disabilities, which is about 100,000 voters. So it's actually a fairly significant block of people. Disability voter turnout has always lagged behind voters without disabilities. That's improved some, I think, with some of these features. And for many people, going to the polls is a really significant, aspect of living in a democracy, and people with disabilities want to go to the polls like everybody else. However, absentee voting is very important for people with disabilities who cannot get to a polling place for whatever reason. There are a lot of barriers to that. There's transportation issues that are still a major problem for people to get to the polls in a timely manner. There's people who just physically not, aren't comfortable going. They're alone. There are a bunch of reasons why people might want to vote absentee. It's even more important now, and I think Virginia's going to talk about that with the current situation now in terms of people not really wanting to go to the polls.
Yes.
But to get to paper ballots. Paper ballots are inherently inaccessible for people with certain types of disabilities. Anybody who has a visual impairment can't vote independently and privately with the paper ballot. Anybody who has what we call a print disability, so they can't manipulate a pencil, they can't, for some reason, fill out a ballot, physically, that it impacts them. So paper balloting by itself is just not accessible to a large group of people with disabilities. That's why we're we think it's so important that there's some electronic capacity there to get the ballot and fill it out.
Thank you, Laura. Virginia, how has the pandemic made absentee balloting even more of an acute issue for people with disabilities?
Well, as Laura was mentioning, accessible absentee voting options mean people with disabilities don't have to navigate inaccessible public transportation, wait in a queue, worry about the inaccessibility of the polling station once they get there. Or IFAS, my organization, works mostly abroad. We don't work here in the US. And one of the main things we hear from voters in other countries is that voters with disabilities, that when they get to the polling station, their right to vote is often even questioned by poll workers. So having these alternative measures available where people with disabilities don't have to deal with any of the discrimination or the inaccessibility is really important generally. In the current context, absentee voting provides a way to safely vote without risking exposure to the virus, which is something I think everyone is concerned with, but many people with disabilities are also immunocompromised or have some other pre-existing health condition that might make them particularly at higher risk from the virus or adverse reactions to the virus. So avoiding exposure then becomes particularly important. And in addition to those risks related to the virus, there's also benefits from absentee voting around independence and privacy for some voters with disabilities. So for example, if you're voting from home, you can use your own assistive device like an adaptive keyboard or software such as a screen reader or voice recognition software to help you mark the ballot. And that's probably not going to be available to you in the polling station. So here in the US, for example, there's an estimated 7 million adults that have a visual disability. And many advocates are concerned that if there aren't options for people with visual disabilities to vote independently and privately, they might choose to skip voting altogether rather than risk catching the virus and or having their ballot privacy compromised if there's not an accessible absentee ballot option.
Thank you. So Anthony, earlier this year, as a way to address these and other issues, your department offered up to certain people with disabilities and other Delawareans overseas an internet-based OmniBallot system developed by the tech company Democracy Live out of Seattle. Can you and Chris take a moment to describe the system's accessibility features, which allowed people with disabilities to mark and return ballots digitally?
Sure, thank you. So the system that is offered, as you mentioned, and we're always very clear to say, of course, it uses the internet, but it's certainly not internet voting or anything of that nature, because we like to be very clear about that. But it is a means for individuals who are not able to access their ballot, in a manner such as you mentioned, individuals with disabilities, those who are especially military as well, overseas, maybe serving in forward deployments with limited access. It gives them the capability to access their ballot and to be connected with adaptive technologies as well to do so, and provide various options to return their ballot, including options that are outside of the realm of mail, although that is provided as an option. Mail, email as an attachment, fax, some people still use fax as well, and to provide those options. It's a very easy to use system. It is a very intuitive type of system, and that was something that we were looking for. This system actually, and the need for it, was precipitated by the fact that we had previously an in-house system that we offered, which had similar capabilities. But when the state switched over to new voting equipment last year in 2019, that was a complete changeover, including the voter registration and election management systems that are kind of the back-end operations. So the legacy system was no longer compatible with our new system. So we had to obtain or connect with an entity that could offer that service. So we wanted to have a continuation, certainly, of the capabilities and the service we provided to the voters. Previously, we didn't want to, certainly take any steps backwards, because we have been offering this to our voters for such a long time. And just a very little bit of history. as Laura mentioned earlier, Delaware being ahead of the curve with some of our equipment. In addition, legislatively, we've been pretty far ahead. Our law, Delaware Code, provides for electronic delivery and return of absentee ballots for military and overseas voters since 2010, and for voters who are sick or may have a disability since 2012. So we were actually pretty far ahead on that, and very. That's something we want to be sure to continue and certainly be sure to offer. And I'll pass it to Chris, if I may. Chris, I don't know if you wanted to speak to anything more specific about the connectivity or anything with regards to the accessibility pieces.
Thank you, Anthony, and thanks for sharing our background on our being innovative as a state. And for years, we've been trying to comply and adhere to best practices and provide services to our servicemen overseas, our citizens overseas, and as well as our sick and disabled community. It is our goal that to always make it accessible and be forthcoming to our voters. And we have demonstrated that for so many years. Like you mentioned, we are ahead of the curve in terms of voting technology. Long before people wanted to use electronic voting machines, we were way ahead of that. We were there for 20 years. And while people were going on board on new technology, we were already moving on to the next generation of technologies. We were moving on to voting machines with paper ballot that is auditable. We are moving into ADA compliant voting machines, for example. Even the ones that we just obtained now, our people on wheelchairs can actually roll into the machines, and it's actually on a certain height where people can actually just easily and conveniently vote on an actual voting machines at polling places. As far as online accessible voting, we've started a long time ago with our legacy system, where we started, making it available to people overseas and sick and disabled. And we continued on that despite moving out of the legacy system, and we lost some capabilities in terms of close integration. Basically, our legacy systems were closely integrated, and they flow and share information closely. With new voting machines, with new voter registration systems, we need to have something that will continue to provide that same level of service, but still have to maintain that close integration. And that's where we partnered with Democracy Live, because the service, we do feel that it is important to make that available. And then,
sorry, go ahead.
And that's where we actually move on to the topic today about where are we with people.
Thank you. I know that allowing people to mark their ballots digitally also relieves them from relying on others to mark and return ballots for them. It provides them with the privacy option that everybody else has when they vote. This was another feature that you considered imperative for Delaware as well.
Yes, I can jump in on that. That's definitely something that we want to be sure. And just, even on the same, just on a similar vein, even with our voting equipment in the polling place, and certainly with our new voting equipment, which has further enhancements as well, and accessibility enhancements for voters. We always want voters from any background to have the same level of access, and that's always been something we've been committed to. Absentee, as well as in the polling place. We don't want voters to, voters who may have a mobility challenge or another challenge to feel that they have to access some other piece of equipment separate and apart from the voting equipment. That's not how things should be, and that's certainly not how we would ever wanted to operate.
So we've discussed some of the accessibility features that made Democracy Live, that made OmniBallot as well as you having an interest in these things before you adopted the system, that made it attractive to you. But there also were security concerns, and so much so that the Department of Homeland Security and a study by MIT and the University of Michigan called the system high risk and vulnerable to undetected hacking and malware. And they also said it presented privacy concerns. So Anthony and Chris, can you, both of you, as well as Laura and Virginia, feel free to comment as well. If you could discuss what made the system vulnerable in those ways.
Chris, Chris, I don't know if you'd like to start on that. I can always jump in as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anthony. So we reviewed the study or the analysis from the paper released by the folks from MIT, and we take everything seriously. Not only do we allow people accessibility, but we need to make sure that it's secure as well. And that's there's no point in being able to vote when you do not trust the system that allows you to vote. So they have to come hand in hand. We need to provide balance to make sure that you have the integrity for voting, and the integrity of elections and democracy actually still being upheld. So let's talk about a couple of things that came out from the review, and we took them into consideration. We spoke to our friends at Democracy Live. We spoke to our state Department of Technology and Information, and reviewed it thoroughly and considered what our options are. For example, some of the recommendations, and we appreciate everybody. We are all on the same page as providing elections, securing elections, and providing accessibility. I think this community, we appreciate your interest and your participation. We appreciate the MIT's input, and we appreciate the technology side of it, because we need to have this conversation, because it's important that we all have the good balance of providing secure voting and accessibility. Let's talk about the recommendations that from the MIT folks, and about eliminating the electronic ballot return. CISA and DHS, for example, all look at it as a higher risk option for electronic return by nature of it being on the internet. Again, this is we cannot equate voting with anything in accounting or business industries, so we have to take that seriously. And after careful consideration, we do have eliminated the electronic ballot return. Okay, and then there's also other things but one thing's for sure, despite all of that, one thing's for sure is the OmniBallot delivery and marking methods have a potential to be valuable tools for everybody for voters to participate in the election. And we do take all the recommendations seriously and have taken steps on what else can we do to make sure that our voters are actually confident about their votes and be able to participate and use the tool, and that we can continue to offer the tool, providing them the confidence they can use it.
So thank you, and I know you got a little bit ahead of some of the chronology that I wanted to also discuss, because I know that while some of our viewers of today's webinar have been following this very closely, some others are hearing about this for the first time. So after the criticisms came out, many of them earlier this month. Initially, I know that your office, Elections, was still insisting that the system was fit as far as security is concerned. But after that, last week, the system actually came down for a period of time. And as you have been discussing, Chris, more recently, your department spent time re-examining and working on the system, connecting with the folks at MIT, the folks at Democracy Live, as you mentioned, to address a lot of these security issues. And in the wake of that collaboration over the past several days, the two of you, I know, Anthony, maybe you want to have the moment to make this clear to our viewers today of our webinar, that you do have a big reveal, you do have big news that after taking the system down just last week, I think you have something to say.
Sure. Thanks, Victor. We did, as you mentioned, out of an abundance of caution, and certainly caution from security standpoint around elections is always paramount all around, certainly in light of the various items that were included in the research articles. We did make a decision to pause our use of the system, and what we used that time to do was to consult very closely, not only with speaking with the authors of the study and hearing, talking to them one-on-one, not just reading their research, but talking with them and, getting their input and their perspective in conjunction with our Department of Technology and Information, or DTI, with whom we work with hand in hand all the time, and working with our Chief Information Security Officer, which is the Chief Security liaison for the state overall for information security, and working with him and his team very closely. And after conversations with the researchers about their findings, and then internal conversations with DTI, with the Chief Information Security Officer and his group, as I mentioned, we did decide that we could resume use of the system, and we are able to do so making some additional security enhancements to the system. And these are enhancements that we are making now. And we are also looking longer term, as we move forward past the current cycle, because we're still technically in the pilot project for the presidential primary, but looking to the fall, how we can continue to make further enhancements and build on what we're doing now in the realm of security. Some things that may take a little bit longer to work with our folks at DTI and our partners at Democracy Live to do that. And I may ask Chris again, to offer some of the details if you'd like on that. But our priority always is, it's a balance, as I like to say. It's always a balancing act. We want to balance availability, convenience, accessibility with security. And we know there are different points of view out there. We know there are some out in the world in general, certainly who have. Certainly, and the security concerns, we don't take those lightly by any means. But we know some people have skepticism about any use of technology around elections. And the reality is we need to use technology, but we need to use it intelligently, appropriately, and in a fashion that balances those needs. And I think that, we have good, very solid partners in our vendor, and extremely sound partners in DTI that we work with hand in hand daily. And, they have confidence in what's happening. They are walking lockstep with us. And I certainly have full faith behind them that we can make this even more secure while maintaining our convenience and accessibility. But if we have a minute, I ask Chris if you wanted to speak to any of the particular items that we've initially done.
Yes, and specifically, Chris, and thank you, Anthony. Specifically, I know that our audience is extremely interested, and now that the system is back online, what is the same as before as far as marking and returning ballots, and what has changed? I know you mentioned some things about security, Anthony, so I'd like it very much if you could address some of those security enhancements, but also practically speaking, for people who will be accessing this system, what is now available to them as far as marking and returning their ballots?
Yes. Thank you for that. So going back to accessibility and what's available to the public, very little has changed as far as from where we started 2 weeks ago and when we resumed Democracy Live for online ballot marking. So to begin with, how do we communicate to the voter that they are able to go to the website and start retrieving the ballot? Because that's the first, which is the ballot delivery section. So the ballot delivery section is very important in the sense that it cuts down, as even the study would actually explain there, is that it's half the trip. You don't have to go to the mail and go to the post office or go to your mailbox to pull it. We send it to you electronically. And how does that work? So once you request for an absentee ballot and you specify the reasons why you're voting absentee, that triggers the department to know how you will be receiving the notification. So we communicate to our voters through email, and the email will state to them that you will, this is where you're going to get your ballot, which is the Democracy Live OmniBallot system, and they will be given the information they're required to provide to the system. So that hasn't changed. The people can still go online and pull it. The user experience and security is more of a back-end process. From the user's perspective, they shouldn't be burdened by the security. It's more about usability. So that's why that's not a lot. Even though we implement additional security measures, the usability shouldn't be impacted or be on the side for that. So in a way, we try to minimize the impact to the voter. So it's user experience, you log in, you use the system, which is fully ADA compliant, so they can use screen readers and things like that, or SIP and FOBs and other assistive technologies using the system to view the ballot, mark the ballot like they used to. There's no difference in that. And then the output of that is actually in a summary of their selections. So that's one thing that was actually highlighted on our assessment with our talks with the MIT folks, and as well as with our partners with Democracy Live, that we can provide the service to mark the ballot with few tweaks in order for it to improve our security posture. Provided that, and so that's the experience. They pull the outcome is they have the summary of their ballots. Once they have the ballot, the marked ballots, they can review it and send it back to us. We still offer a lot of options for our voters. We still have the regular mail option to return it. We provide instructions on which election office they should be sending it based on the county where they reside. They can still send it via fax, and they can still send it via email. All of those are provided to them instructions-wise and where they need to provide it. We cannot eliminate, and I have to put it out there, we cannot eliminate some parts of the process where it's paper-based. But that's just part of the balancing act between we deliver it to you in a secure manner. We provide you the ability to be able to make your options, make your voices heard through the ballot. But there is the other side of the story that it has to come back to us. And these are the things that are available to us right now, that you can send it by mail, by email, and by fax.
The electronic return is the main change from before till now, correct? With that being
correct.
And that's what was identified in that research. Again, in the opinion, the findings, the opinion of the researchers, that was identified as the area of high risk, if you will. So, again, we think that, and again, our partners at DTI, agree with us on this. Is that we're able to balance providing all that other functionality, even if we don't have the online return option, and that helps to minimize, and address what is considered the high, quote unquote, high risk piece.
Anthony, how will the department, indeed, how will the state now go about informing people about the availability of this system. And it's my understanding that it's available to more people than originally designed. Basically now with the pandemic, it's now anyone who is social distancing can be doing this kind of absentee balloting, as well as visiting polling places if they wish. But up till now, the system has been underused. I believe only a few thousand people have accessed it so far. So how are you all going to promote it so people know that it's out there and that they can access it?
Mm-hmm. We'll be working with our partners here to do some outreach about the accessibility features of it, and also working to continue to enhance the visibility on our sites in terms of how it is available. And as you mentioned, yes, there is some, and I know that's an area that some people also, perhaps have had concerns about, that there's a wide use, because we do, the way Delaware law is written, the availability of the electronic delivery and return is afforded to those who are, as the code language says, those who are sick or disabled, and there is no restriction on that, and there is no requirement for any sort of documentation or things like that, other than identifying yourself. And under the provisions of the current state of emergency that are at least in effect now, as you said, that clarified reasons around COVID-19 being considered an acceptable circumstance to utilize the existing reason of sick or having a disability. So we're unlike some other states. Some other states have more stringent requirements. Perhaps for absentee, they require more documentation for certain reasons. Delaware historically hasn't had that for many years. We've never, in any recent memory, we've never had those requirements. It is a self-identification and affirmation by the voter that they are qualified to vote. And they are qualified based on the reason they cite.
So let's talk a bit about the future, about the future of this and remote accessible systems in Delaware generally. This one is being offered up only for the July primary. But what about the general election in November and elections beyond then? Anthony, how is your office looking at the future as far as this system and systems like it are concerned?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I mentioned a little earlier, we're working very closely with our partners at DTI for how we will offer these services through the fall and really long-term permanently. What's the best way to do that? Again, functionally, I don't think it'll, and as Chris mentioned, functionally, I don't think it will really appear in a significant way differently to voters. There may be more back-end options that are the security enhancements that we'll be continuing to work on. And we'd like to also explore options for additional validations, perhaps as available to the voters. Are there options down the line? Again, this will take a little more development. Well, again, won't impact usability, but will there be capabilities for us to offer more ways for voters to verify their choices, maybe to validate things like of that nature? That's something that we want to offer to voters, especially when they're using a newer technology and they're not perhaps, for example, seeing a physical ballot in their hand, so to speak. We would like to give options and work on options where we can provide that capability. So that's a little bit over the longer term, but we're certainly very much fully committed to providing the service. We just want to continue to do it in an as convenient, in as secure of a way, and in a way that gives as much reassurance to the voters too.
Thank you. So, Laura, from what you've heard, what do you believe needs to happen to make the system more accessible? And Laura and Virginia, what are the other ways that you believe the state can go about making absentee balloting more accessible?
Well, I think, from the disability perspective, I mean, if you remind people, that the accessibility is actually a legal requirement. It's not something that must be done. So it's a question of how. I think that it's important, I mean, as to use a cliche, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to security versus accessibility, because you run the risk of disenfranchising a lot of people if, it's important. I think Anthony's approach has been, Delaware's approach has been pretty measured, and then that they have done their assessments and done the work. And I think that's important. I think instead of trying to knock systems down, which is what Professor Haldeman has been doing with it, let's work on fixing security. Rather, he's from Michigan, yeah. He's a very loud critic of internet voting, but I don't know that he's a lot about coming up with solutions. And I think Delaware's approach, which is addressing security concerns and coming up with solutions, is where the emphasis needs to be. I just want to point out, there's some litigation involving Pennsylvania's voting machine. And there was an opinion earlier this year where the judge basically indicated that a lot of what some of the cyber concerns are fantasy and very small risk. So I think it's important to keep that in perspective, and I think that there needs to be a balance, but not to the point where you're disenfranchising individuals with disabilities. So I think the focus needs to be on addressing the security concerns, and because even for somebody who is visually impaired, who doesn't have a printer, who I guess if they have a computer, that's great, but they may have a device that they can't use the system on. So I think you need to work on continuing to evolve these technology solutions for people to be able to vote. And I think the other thing Delaware could do, and they were headed that way, is to do a no excuse absentee balloting. Most states have that. Delaware is in the minority in that regard. So there's some other legislative things that can be done to improve accessibility for everybody. So those would be the things that I think that they should be focusing on.
Virginia, do you have thoughts to add about how the state could go about making absentee balloting more accessible?
Well, I think, Anthony brought up the issue of verifiability, and that's sort of the future and where you're looking towards working, which I think is great. We find internationally with paper ballots, people tend to trust the chain of custody from, when they mark it to when they put it in the ballot box to when it's counted, at least in US and Europe. In some other countries, the moment the ballot leaves the polling station, people don't trust it anymore at all, whether that method of leaving is, physically the paper ballot leaving, or if it's leaving, via the internet. So I think it's really important to have contextualized solutions. And that will help build trust, in the EMB, and then hopefully also in the democracy in the country. So the way that it's being approached here, using local solutions and also taking advantage of, the public trust here in Delaware, I think is great and makes good sense. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. There's also, of course, a flip side concern that as more attention and access is given to absentee and remote voting, that in-person voting at polling places could be neglected. I know you have expertise in that area and some thoughts you'd like to share.
Yeah, I think all measures that are open to the general public, whether that be remote voting options or in-person voting options, need to be made accessible to people with disabilities. So we find often in other countries that alternative voting measures that are developed are used as a substitute to making the polling station accessible rather than as an addition. So for example, there's many things you can do in the polling station to make sure that voters that do want to go to the polling station and vote alongside everyone else have an option to do that. Polling stations could have electronic voting machines where voters can plug in their own headsets. We see use widely of tactile ballot guides so that voters who are blind can vote on their own and in secret. And tactile ballot guides can be developed either with a Braille option, like for example Tunisia does, or with just a tactile option with dots that are raised, which is done in Sierra Leone, or for example in the UK, they have both. So their tactile ballot guides have both raised sort of dots that you can follow or Braille. So it doesn't matter whether someone has Braille literacy or not. They can still vote, on their own in secret in the polling station. There's also countries that have large font ballots, or in Armenia, for example, they have magnifying sheets that are at every polling station for all voters to use. That also helps people that might not self-identify as having a disability, like older people, but could still benefit from, that assistive device. Costa Rica, they have large grip pencils to help you mark your ballot if you have a dexterity disability. So there's many options within a traditional polling station setting that can help, enhance accessibility. There's also alternatives like mobile ballot boxes. They're commonly used in countries all around the world, but with the virus, that might not be perhaps the best method right now. That said, we just supported elections in Serbia this past weekend on Sunday. They had parliamentary elections there, and they did use a tactile ballot guide, and they had strict guidance both for the mobile ballot box teams and for the voters that, everyone had to have masks on and gloves. But what we heard is that the officially issued masks were really very uncomfortable, and the poll workers and those using the mobile ballot boxes in particular were not, comfortable wearing them all day, so maybe weren't as strict keeping them on as they should be. So that's something I think that we need to think about as more and more elections are beginning to move forward while we're still in the middle of this pandemic. And then, here in the US, postal voting is another option that's being explored, but also it's not always accessible for everybody. One last thing that is done in many countries and here in the US is advanced voting, but something that's unique is in the Philippines, for example, you can go vote if you have a disability in a shopping mall, because shopping malls are usually some of the most accessible buildings around. And you can also register to vote in the mall. And so that's something that is, I don't know why we don't all do that, rather than having to find some random administrative building or some school that you're not familiar with. I think everybody knows sort of where the mall is, and usually they're accessible. So the best solution, I'd say, is really to mix all of these measures so voters can approve or can choose, the approach that best suits them.
Victor, I'm sorry to jump in, Victor. If you have a minute, could I just actually make a quick comment, or actually just kind of augment what Virginia was saying as well, just kind of talking very briefly about our polling place accessibility features as well. I can keep it real brief. Like I mentioned earlier, we've always been committed with our, even with our legacy, our old voting machines. We've never been had a mindset of having, a separate set of machines that are accessible. And our new machines, just because of the newer technology, they have a lot of additional features that we did not offer previously on the screens. We have the ability to display in large fonts. We have the ability for contrast, black and white versus color. The universal voting console device that's available, and again, anyone can use the universal voting console without any question, and they're available in every polling place. They have a lot of tactile items on them, as well as braille, raised edges, different shaped different shaped buttons. Also has an input for other assistive devices like Sip and Puff that we never had previously. And again, they're fully accessible on each machine. And what's also a nice step forward versus our previous accessibility module on the machine is you can dip in and dip out of that. Like I said, in addition to anyone being able to use it, previously, if you used what we called our ADA module or ADAM at that point, you were, and I know Laura and others will remember this, I'm sure, from seeing it, you were pretty much committed. Once you started it, you pretty much had to go through the whole process. What's nice about these devices is that we can plug this into a machine, and then you can dip in and out, either using the UVC console or just going right back to the screen if you'd like to use it that way. And again, the audio presentation of the ballot. So we're really happy with some of the additional features we have on the new machines in the polling place, and they're available everywhere. And again, anyone is welcome to use them. And even if you just want to try them, even if someone who may not necessarily have a need to use them, we welcome you to try them at a polling place, just to kind of get the experience.
Yeah, just to jump in for a second, I think the equipment is great. I mean, we've at the Disabilities Law Program, we monitor polling places on election days, and I think the concern, what we see, it's more of an issue. The quality control issues and accessibility are on election day, in terms of making sure the polling places themselves are physically accessible and that the poll workers are trained. Right. That's like an ongoing thing. Maybe, but I think particularly with the new machine, has outstanding accessibility. It's the other aspects of it that we need to continue to work, I think.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Well, thank you all for addressing all of these questions up till now. I'd like, however, to turn this over to questions from our audience. So, Zach, I know that they've been coming in throughout our program. If you would, please dip into them and ask our panelists what's on the mind of our audience.
Certainly. First question goes to Laura. What is no excuse absentee balloting?
Means anybody can get, currently, and it's in the Constitution, unfortunately, in Delaware, currently only people with physical disabilities and people who are sick there's specific categories of people who can get absentee ballots. Other people cannot. If it's no excuse, it literally means that. There's no excuse. Anybody can get one. You don't have to give a reason or meet it or fall into a particular category.
Thank you. This is for Anthony and Chris. The current ballot return system used, you mentioned, is email, but that has inherent risks as well. What security measures are in place to reduce those risks?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Chris, you want to jump in on that? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you for the question. So it has inherent risk, and that's certainly true for any technology, anything that involves technology. And we approach it in two ways. So number one, when you receive your ballot, and that's, I'll bring back what Anthony was mentioning about end-to-end verification. It's something we are looking into down the line to make sure that what you have is what we got. And anything in between is actually of no use, with what we're saying. So basically, initially, on the short term, we do offer the ability to use the state secure mail service. As far as we know, this is the best option we have available for the voter to feel confident that there is the integrity and confidentiality of the email, of the attachment they're sending. Again, in terms of technology, as this study which have showed you, that it's hard to tell what the experience is, what the end point is, or what the users are experiencing on their end. It's hard for departments like us, or departments or organizations providing services to their constituents to know definitely what the computer status, the status of the computers of the people using them. It's hard to say whether are they infected or not infected, but one thing's for sure, that they need to be able to view and see and confirm what their selections are, and that be able to confirm with us that what we got is how they intended to vote their ballots. So we do have the secure email capabilities at the moment, and we also are looking into end-to-end verification sometime down the line. I think Virginia and Anthony touched on those a little bit earlier on. Thank you.
Thanks very much. The next question, I think, also goes, mostly to you, Anthony. Has Delaware considered the Maryland solution to ballot delivery, which is to say a voter-trusted agent returns the ballot for people with disabilities?
Delaware law doesn't have any restrictions in terms of who can provide a ballot, who can return a ballot. So someone can essentially have a trusted agent as well. And sometimes we'll see that, family member, spouse, parent returning for a child as well. So that would not be prohibited per our current law, certainly. Our law doesn't speak to it at all, but it's in not speaking to it, it's certainly not prohibited.
But you wouldn't want to, this is Laura, you wouldn't want to rely on that. That's something, that's an option for somebody, but that's,
right.
There have to be other options that allow people to vote independently and privately.
Right, exactly. That's a good point. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, France, for example, allows proxy voting, which, I mean, you always need multiple options, but this, I have a lot of concerns with that. Proxy voting could really be abused. And by proxy voting, I mean, not just returning the ballot for someone else where they marked it themselves, but someone else actually going to the polling station and marking the ballot for you in your place. So that, I think, is problematic.
So next question, Virginia. Well, Delaware is making strides in terms of eliminating paper ballots. Other states and other countries may not be making those strides. In your experience, what have you seen that's been effective in terms of community advocacy to eliminate paper balloting or to make voting more accessible generally?
I'd say the best example is in Australia, in New South Wales. Australia is unique in that voting is mandatory there. So it's not like here and many other countries where you vote if you want, you don't vote if you want. Australia, Peru, quite a few countries around the world mandate voting. And if you don't vote, you have to pay a fine. So in Australia, they've been really active in trying to ensure that there are accessible ways for people to vote, for everyone to vote. So since 2011 there, they've had a system where voters with disabilities can either call in with their vote, or now they do have an electronic ballot delivery system as well. So that's something that I think is particularly interesting, especially the call-in option. That might be something that could be used in other countries. Estonia has all internet voting for all voters. Everything is online. But for the most part, in the countries where IFAS is working, internet voting or online, return options of your ballot are not available. We're really focused on making the polling station accessible and having alternative measures, like the mobile ballot box.
So in those countries like Estonia and New South Wales in Australia, have those changes, the move towards more electronic voting systems, have those come sort of from the top down, or have they come through community advocacy?
Australia, I'm very familiar. I'm more familiar with that context than Estonia. Estonia, I think it was more the government, there's wide internet penetration in the whole country. And so the government was able to make the switch for all voters to vote online. And there's also a high level of public trust there. So that maybe came more organically. In Australia, it was very much advocacy from the disability rights community saying if voting is mandatory and we do want to participate and we do want to vote, then we need to have accessible options. So it's one was from the disability community and the other was maybe more, my understanding at least, from the government.
Thank you. Next question is following up, Anthony, on looking forward to the presidential election this November. If the current bill to expand vote by mail is passed, would it be possible for some sort of information sheet to be sent out along with ballot applications to outline possibilities for Delaware's current possibilities for voters with disabilities?
Yeah, we will have information that goes out with the mailing, so we can certainly look at putting that in there. Mm-hmm.
Those are the questions I've received so far. Anyone else who has questions, please use the chat feature and type them in. Here we are. Were you aware that part of the report issued by MIT and the University of Michigan talked about voters' data privacy and some of their personal voting information being exposed to employees from Democracy Live? Are you aware that if Democracy Live has updated that privacy policy?
So thank you for the question. Very good question, actually. Democracy Live has taken that. It's an action item for them. We have spoken to them and we have constant communication with Democracy Live, and they have taken that recommendation very seriously, and they are in the process of, if they haven't done so yet, to put that privacy policy out there. Yes.
Thank you. So as of this moment, what is the Department of Elections' current, not policy, but how does the Department of Elections interact with stakeholders in the disability community to find out where there are possible areas that need to be addressed in terms of accessibility?
Well, I think we have, pretty regular communication. We can always have more communications. I think forums like this, I've known and worked with Laura over the years in my previous position in elections, and with our work on polling place accessibility and there are other means. I'm certainly always available and willing to have conversations in whatever forum and certainly by any means, because we want to hear what's out there and do our best to try to meet the needs. Absolutely.
How specifically can the disability community be helpful to you? What kind of feedback is most valuable as you move forward?
I'll just say any thoughts, ideas. I mean, we can't implement everything, certainly, but we certainly are willing and happy to hear ideas, and if there's anything collaboratively we can do, working together to helping getting the word out, assisting in any way that we can to share information. I think just having an ongoing dialogue and just being as collaborative as we can, going forward and continuing.
Laura, for our viewers from out of state, what are some accessibility issues that disability rights groups are addressing in other states' voting systems?
Well, actually, there's been some litigation in the last. Because a bunch of states have run the primaries under the same circumstances that we're in terms of dealing with discouraging people from actually going to physical polling places and voting from home. So a lot of states have expanded their absentee balloting or done kind of an emergency mail-in balloting. And there was litigation in Michigan and New York and Pennsylvania recently involving providing an accessible option for individuals with disabilities to vote absentee or by mail-in. That's continuing in other states as well. Minnesota is currently being reviewed to make sure that they're providing an accessible option for people with disabilities to vote either absentee or by mail-in. So it's a kind of an ongoing issue. I think we're lucky in Delaware that we have a unified system. There's one machine that's used in every single voting place. It's new. It's a huge advantage to the kind of patchwork systems that you see in other states. So I know some of my colleagues in other states have had much more to deal with than I've had to deal with. It kind of gives me the luxury of dealing with some of these other issues in more detail. But I think it's important that we remain vigilant in terms of registration. There's accessibility around issues around registration, and then there's around voting. Like I said, what we focus on a lot during election years is the physical accessibility of polling places. Obviously, that's not as big that may not be as big an issue this year because there won't be as many, but it's just sort of an ongoing vigilance in that regard. Like I said, Delaware's, it's a different set of challenges in Delaware than in other states to some degree.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We are virtually at the end of our hour. The hour sped by. I just want to add a few things at the end. Everyone who is part of our audience today will be receiving an evaluation form. We ask you to fill it out and return it to us later today about the webinar that you just viewed. Also, I would like to thank very much all of our panelists today, Virginia Atkinson, Christopher Ramos, Anthony Albence, and Laura Waterland. And unlike Australia, we cannot mandate that you vote in the primary, but we nevertheless encourage you to do so, both in the primary and then again in November for the general election. Thank you very much for joining us today.